On Monday, June 4th, 2012, 34-year-old Eric Samoa stood between two brand-new Jaguar cars on the showroom floor of a luxury car dealership in Bethesda, Maryland. Eric was talking to a potential new car buyer. Eric was this dealership's top salesperson, sometimes pulling in between $10,000 and $20,000 US in commission checks every month. Eric was very handsome. He wore a well-fitted black suit and a red tie, and he was tall with a shaved head, brown eyes, and a goatee. Eric smiled at his potential customer, told him a joke, and then put his hand on the guy's shoulder like they were old friends. But pretty quickly, Eric sensed this guy was not actually ready to buy a car just yet. Still though, Eric had not become the top salesperson at this dealership by giving up at the first sign that the customer is not fully committed. Instead, Eric just continued talking and listening to the guy, doing his best to establish a real connection. That way, when this guy came back and was ready to buy a car, he would hopefully come back to Eric. The potential customer walked around one of the Jaguars and told Eric he would definitely think about buying it. He said he loved how it looked, he just needed to talk to his wife first. Eric said he totally understood, and then he handed the guy his business card and walked him out of the showroom and said he looked forward to meeting with him again. Then Eric turned and walked back across the showroom floor, past all the polished, perfectly lit cars, into a bright carpeted hallway that led to the break room and a few offices. Eric walked into his manager's office and said he was taking off for the day. His manager told him to have a good night, and Eric just grinned, because he definitely had a good night planned, and he couldn't wait to get it started. About 15 minutes later, Eric pulled into the parking lot of his high-rise luxury apartment building in Silver City, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. The apartment building was the type of place that catered to young professionals, with a rooftop pool and plenty of bars and restaurants within walking distance. Eric walked into the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor, where his place was. Once inside his apartment, he went right to the kitchen and poured himself a drink. Then he headed to his bedroom and changed into black jeans and a black t-shirt, and then he walked out onto a small balcony. He left the door open behind him. Out on his balcony, Eric sipped his drink as he watched the local restaurants and bars down below come to life. Eric loved this part of town, and he loved his apartment, especially because he'd had to work so hard to be able to afford it. Eric was the youngest of 4 children born to immigrant parents from Ghana. And when Eric and his siblings were kids, their parents had told them that the United States was filled with opportunity, and that in the United States, they could be anything they wanted as long as they worked really hard. So Eric had grown up basically believing the American dream was true, that if he put in the work, he would be successful. And looking out from his balcony inside of his upscale neighborhood, Eric felt like he was definitely on the right path. Selling luxury cars had really paid off. He made great money, and he had no intention of slowing down. Just then, Eric heard a knock at his door. He turned around and walked through his apartment and put his glass down on the coffee table, then opened up the front door and saw a 34-year-old Katrina Ben standing there. Katrina smiled, got up on her toes, and threw her arms around Eric's neck and gave Eric a big kiss. Then they both went inside, and Katrina curled up on the brown leather couch in front of the TV, and Eric went to the kitchen to pour Katrina a glass of wine, and then he joined her on the couch. Eric and Katrina had been seeing each other for a few months, but they were still keeping things really casual. They had met outside of the apartment building and discovered right away they had a lot in common. Katrina shared Eric's really strong work ethic, and it's what allowed her to become a nurse. They also both loved basketball, and so their relationship consisted of basically hanging out a couple of times a week, watching a basketball game together, and then spending the night together. And that night in particular, they were both really excited because there was this big NBA playoff game on. And so, sitting on the couch, Eric and Katrina talked about who they thought was going to win the game, and then they also talked about how their jobs were going. But Eric looked a bit distracted. He kept picking up his phone and checking the time. Finally, he just turned and asked Katrina if she was up for going on a quick ride before the game started. Katrina figured he just wanted to go out and maybe pick up some food or something, but no, Eric told her he actually wanted to go meet a guy who he could buy marijuana from. He said the guy lived close and it wouldn't take very long. Katrina was surprised. She knew Eric occasionally smoked weed, but he'd never asked her to go buy weed with him. Still, she figured it wasn't that big of a deal. They were in a really nice suburb, so how dangerous could this weed dealer really be? So Katrina told him that was fine, as long as they got back in time for the start of the game. Eric promised they wouldn't miss a thing. Then he and Katrina left the apartment, went down the elevator, and out to Eric's car. After driving for a few minutes, Eric turned onto a side street in front of a small apartment complex, and he pulled over to the curb and put his car in park. To Katrina, the street seemed totally empty, but suddenly the back driver's side door opened, and this tall, skinny-looking drug dealer with a scraggly beard slid into the back seat. The dealer quickly handed a paper bag over the seat to Eric, and Eric took the bag, he looked inside, and he saw a Ziploc baggie of marijuana, and after he was satisfied, he handed the cash back to the dealer. The dealer then hopped out of the car without a word, closed the door, and disappeared back into the apartment complex. The entire exchange took less than a minute. Eric turned and smiled at Katrina, and then he turned the car back on, and he drove them back to his place just in time to watch the opening tip-off of the playoff game. And then later that night, after the game was over, Eric and Katrina went to bed together. Then, right before Katrina actually went to sleep, she reminded Eric that she had to work early the next day, so pretty likely when he woke up in the morning, she'd be gone. Eric said he totally remembered, then he kissed Katrina goodnight, and the couple rolled over and they both drifted off to sleep. And hours later, in the early morning of June 5th, 2012, Eric was still asleep in his bed when somebody walked into his bedroom, walked across the floor, and stood right beside him, staring down at him as he slept. The following day, so June 6th, Eric's manager at the luxury car dealership sat in his office trying to get a hold of Eric on the phone. Eric was supposed to work that day, but he hadn't shown up, and his phone kept going to voicemail. Top salespeople like Eric occasionally took what everybody at the dealership called unscheduled days off, but Eric always made sure to let his manager know if he wasn't going to come in, and he hadn't on this day. So the manager walked to the showroom floor and talked to a couple of other salespeople, but none of them had heard from Eric either. The manager started to get worried, so he went back to his office and he called Eric's emergency contact, who was one of his older sisters. The manager told Eric's sister he didn't want to upset her, but he hadn't seen or heard from Eric that day. Eric's sister was totally frightened by this, and she immediately called Eric, and when he didn't answer, she called her other sister and her other brother to see if they had heard from him. But they too had not talked to Eric in at least a couple of days. Eric's sister, the one who the car dealership manager had called, had a really uneasy feeling. Eric talked or texted with at least one of his siblings every single day, and so Eric's sister felt like, this was an actual emergency, and so she took a deep breath and dialed 911. After explaining what was going on with Eric, the 911 operator said that police would send officers by Eric's apartment to do a wellness check on him. Eric's sister thanked the dispatcher, and then she went right to her car and raced across town to Eric's apartment building. A little before 5 p.m., Eric's sister waited downstairs in the apartment complex lobby while a building manager led 2 police officers up to Eric's apartment on the 6th floor. One of the officers knocked on Eric's door but got no response, so the building manager unlocked the door and stepped back. At that point, the officers stepped forward, walked inside, and began calling out to see if anybody was home, but again, there was no answer. So the officers walked across the apartment, down a short hallway, and came to a closed bedroom door. One of the officers knocked, but there was still no answer, so they opened up the door and walked inside. And there was Eric laying in bed. There was a sheet that was pulled up all the way up to his mouth. The officers walked over, and they saw there was a single gunshot wound to Eric's head. Both officers thought it looked like Eric Samoa had taken his own life. The officers quickly went back downstairs, and when they got there, one of them placed his hand on Eric's sister's shoulder. He said he was so sorry, but they had found her brother deceased upstairs in his bed. Eric's sister let out a shriek that echoed off the lobby walls. She started wailing and crying. She could not believe her little brother was gone. About 45 minutes after Eric's body was discovered, Detective Dmitry Ruvin of the Montgomery County Police Department walked into the lobby of Eric's apartment building. He saw officers standing with 2 women and a man who were huddled together and crying. Ruvin was one of the youngest detectives on the force, but he did have experience, and other cops basically envied him for his seemingly boundless energy. He waved one of the officers over, and the officer told him the people in the lobby were Eric's siblings. Reuven asked the officer to let them know that he would be down shortly to talk to them. Then Reuven quickly walked across the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor. Reuven walked through Eric's apartment, and he understood why the first officers on the scene had thought Eric killed himself. The door to the apartment had been locked when they arrived, and there was no sign of forced entry, and expensive items like Eric's computer and TV had been left untouched, so this didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. Reuven stepped into the bedroom, and he saw that Eric had a single bullet wound in his head, another sign of a possible suicide. But Reuven searched the entire bedroom and didn't find a gun, so he knew the officers had been wrong. There was no way Eric had shot himself. Someone clearly had shot him. Reuven looked down at Eric's body, and for whatever reason, he felt this instant connection with the guy. He couldn't really explain it. He'd worked a lot of homicide cases, and he always felt sympathy for the victims. But this was something different. This was more personal. Reuven told himself that the reason for this connection must just be because Eric looked to be about the same age as Reuven. It was like, here's this guy with every opportunity in front of him, and somebody took that away from him. And this just made Reuven really upset and angry. It just seemed so wrong. Reuven took out his phone and called the station to let his boss know that this was a homicide, not a suicide, and so he would need an investigative team sent over. And not long after that call, forensics analysts arrived at Eric's apartment and began sweeping through it. And they would discover a single .380 caliber bullet casing in the bedroom, but there still was no sign of a gun anywhere. They also did a sweep of the apartment for fingerprints and possible DNA samples, but they knew that type of evidence might not get them very far in this case. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of struggle meant there was a good chance Eric knew his killer. So the analysts figured they would just find lots of prints of friends or family who were often at Eric's place and so were not suspicious, and any of them could be guilty. And Reuven knew right now 3 of Eric's family members, his sisters and brother, were down in the lobby waiting to talk to him. So Reuven let the forensics team continue their work, and then he headed back downstairs. The elevator doors opened, and Reuven could hear Eric's siblings still crying in the lobby. Reuven walked slowly now, and he heard the sound of his shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He hated this part of the job. Eric's siblings only knew that their brother had been found dead in his apartment. They didn't know what happened. So Reuven lowered his head and approached them, and he told them he was so sorry, but their brother had actually been murdered. That sent Eric's brother and sisters into another fit of screaming. Detective Reuven stood with them and let them get as loud and as angry as they wanted. Then eventually, one of Eric's sisters caught her breath and wiped the tears from her eyes, and she looked right at Reuven, and she told him he needed to speak with a woman named Denise Harrington. Reuven asked who Denise was. Eric's sister said Denise was Eric's girlfriend, and she was no good. She was 20 years older than Eric, and his entire family knew Denise was just using Eric for his money. Reuven thanked Eric's siblings for their time, and he said police would follow up with them soon. Then he offered his condolences again and headed back upstairs. When he got there, he could tell, after hours and hours of searching this apartment, really the only thing investigators had found so far was just that bullet casing. But Reuven felt like this Denise person was a really strong lead, and so it didn't really matter right now that they didn't have much evidence. So Reuven found the phone number for Eric's girlfriend, Denise, gave her a call, and when she picked up, he told her he needed to meet with her to ask some questions about her boyfriend. The day after Eric's body was discovered, members of Reuven's team re-interviewed Eric's brother and sisters and looked into other family members who might have spent time at Eric's apartment. But Reuven himself remained focused on Eric's girlfriend, Denise. At the station, he led Denise into an interview room, sat across from her at a small wooden table, and handed her a bottle of water. He thanked Denise for coming in, and then asked her if she understood why she was there. And she just said, I understand there's some questions about Eric. Reuven nodded, and then asked her very gently if she knew that Eric had been killed. A look of total shock came across Denise's face, and she just began shaking her head, no, and then just said she couldn't believe it. People loved Eric. Reuven watched Denise very closely. She looked genuinely surprised and upset about this news, but he knew some people were naturally just very good actors. Looking at Denise now, it also struck Reuven how big the age gap was between her and Eric. Eric's family clearly had not approved of a woman 20 years older dating their little brother, but Reuven did not think being older than Eric somehow made Denise more suspicious. Reuven asked Denise if it was strange that she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in the last couple of days, before he was killed, but she told him it was not strange that she hadn't heard from Eric because Eric was actually not her boyfriend. Not anymore, anyways. Reuven was confused. Eric's siblings seemed very certain that Denise was seeing Eric and using Eric as far as they were concerned, but Denise explained that she and Eric had hit a rough patch about a month earlier. She found out he was obviously cheating on her when she noticed text messages coming into his phone from 2 other women. And so Denise just did not want to be treated that way, and so she had ended it with Eric, like their relationship was done and she had not talked to him in a while. And Denise said, if somebody close to Eric thought that she, Denise, and Eric were still together, it was probably only because Eric had not told anybody about the breakup. Denise felt like, Eric likely wanted his family to think he was settling down and not still going out and seeing a bunch of different women at the same time. Finally, Reuven asked Denise where she was on the night of the murder, and she said she'd been at home and said police could check her phone records that would prove she was telling the truth. Reuven thanked her for her cooperation and said he would be taking her phone now so they could download the information to help corroborate her alibi. And a little later that day, after police had finished downloading the information from her phone, Reuven gave the phone back and let Denise go. And while Reuven did think Denise was genuinely shocked when she heard the news about Eric, he couldn't help but think, Denise had a clear motive to want to harm Eric. Eric was cheating on her, and a jilted lover almost always had to be considered a viable suspect. But for now, Reuven would just have to wait until his team went through all of that information downloaded off Denise's phone to figure out if she really was a viable suspect. So in the meantime, Reuven headed back up to the 6th floor of Eric's apartment building to talk to some of Eric's neighbors. Reuven knocked on a door that was nearby Eric's apartment, and a guy in his 20s answered. The young man did not look surprised to see a detective standing there. He said he knew Eric pretty well, and he knew Eric had been killed. Then, without being prompted, he told Reuven the police should really question Eric's girlfriend. Reuven said he'd already met with Denise, but the young man just kind of stared at him, and then he said no, Eric's girlfriend's name was not Denise, it was Katrina. If you recall, Katrina was the woman who watched basketball with him on the night he was killed. The neighbor told Reuven that Katrina lived in the apartment building, and he had seen Eric with Katrina a bunch of times. Reuven thanked the young man for his help, and then the door shut, and then Reuven just stood there in the hall thinking. Denise had mentioned during her interview that 2 women had been texting Eric, which is how she had figured out he was cheating on her, but neither of those 2 women were named Katrina. And Eric's family had never mentioned anybody named Katrina at all. And so now, Reuven thought he might have a jilted lover in Denise and a secret lover in Katrina to consider as suspects. Reuven really wanted to make sure he was fully prepared before he brought in Katrina for an interview, so he and his team did some digging. They found out Katrina was from Mississippi, and she had come to Maryland a few months earlier to work as a nurse for the National Institutes of Health, a government organization focused on public health research. But much more important than that, at least to Detective Reuven, was that several people in the apartment building saw Eric and Katrina together on the night before Eric was killed. A couple of days after Eric was killed, Detective Reuven found himself back in an interview room talking to a woman he thought was Eric's girlfriend. And just like he had done with Denise, he started the interview by asking Katrina if she knew why she was there. And Katrina, who had a sort of confused look on her face, told him that, she understood she was here to help with some investigation, but she hadn't been given any more details than that. She figured it might have something to do with where she worked, but she didn't know. At this point, Reuven told her point blank that her boyfriend, Eric, had been found murdered in his apartment, and that she was the last person anybody had seen him with. Immediately, a look of complete disbelief came across her face, and as she pulled her legs up onto her seat and grabbed her knees with her arms and began rocking back and forth, she began saying to Reuven that, why would anybody want to do this? Everybody loves Eric. And then she asked Reuven, is it possible that this was not Eric? But Reuven said no, this was definitely Eric, and he is definitely deceased. At this, Katrina clutched her knees even tighter, and then she looked up at Reuven with a very sad look on her face, and she said, she just felt so guilty. For the past couple of days, she'd been furious at Eric because he had not been responding to any of her text messages. And so she thought he was just being a jerk for some reason, but now she knew why he wasn't responding. It was because he was dead. That realization was like too much for Katrina to handle, and for a minute, it seemed like she might have a total breakdown. But then she stopped rocking in her chair, and she put her feet on the floor, and she leaned forward. It was like something had just clicked in her mind. She told Reuven that something really strange had happened on that last night that she was with Eric. Reuven leaned in and asked Katrina to please walk him through everything she could remember about that night. Katrina took a deep breath, and then she began speaking. She said she and Eric had met up to watch basketball, but they left his apartment so Eric could go buy some weed. Then, after Eric got his weed, the couple went back to Eric's apartment, they watched the game, they had sex, and then they went to sleep. None of this seemed very out of the ordinary to Reuven, and he was about to say as much, but Katrina said, hold on, the weird part happened the next morning. She said the next morning when she woke up around 5 a.m., because she had to get up really early for work, she had looked over and Eric was not in the bed. Then she heard voices coming from some other room. She thought maybe Eric was on the phone, so she just got dressed, grabbed her things, and walked out of the bedroom, and the drug dealer who had sold Eric the marijuana the night before was standing right there. Katrina said this totally freaked her out. Doing, a quick weed deal in the car was one thing, but having a drug dealer in the apartment at 5 a.m. seemed wrong to her. And being a nurse for a government organization, she did not want to be associated with any drug dealers. But that wasn't all. Katrina said when she looked at this dealer, this tall, skinny guy with a scraggly beard, he seemed really agitated. And when Katrina told Eric she was leaving, the dealer turned and looked at her and walked over, grabbed her arm, and basically rushed her out of the apartment and then shut the door behind her. Reuven got Katrina to give him as many details as she could about the dealer and about the location where he had sold Eric marijuana the night before, and after taking all that down, Reuven stopped for a second because he thought of something. He asked Katrina, why didn't you check in on Eric later in the day or really at any point over the next couple of days when he wasn't responding to her text messages? Like the last thing you saw was Eric alone in his apartment with the sketchy drug dealer who rushes you out the door and shuts the door behind you. You said the drug dealer seemed agitated, so what? You just figured everything was fine and you just didn't think to follow up? Katrina could see how suspicious it seemed, but she explained to Reuven that her relationship with Eric was very casual. They basically were not a girlfriend and boyfriend, they were not a couple, they were just kind of hooking up periodically, and that was it. And so Katrina said, she just was worried that if she really aggressively followed up trying to get in touch with Eric and, went over to his place to check on him, that might come off to Eric like she was this really obsessed girlfriend, and she just didn't want that. And then over the course of a couple of days, when Eric did not get in touch with her, she got mad at him. Why is he not getting in touch with her? And so it just kind of led to this silence. Reuven nodded and then thanked Katrina for coming in and told her he would be in touch if he needed more information from her. Not long after Katrina left, Reuven's team worked to track down that drug dealer. And with Katrina's description of him and the exact location of where Eric purchased that marijuana from him, it didn't take them very long to find this guy. His name was William Woodfork, and he quickly became the focus of Reuven's investigation. A couple of days after the interview with Katrina, Reuven sat back down inside the interview room with William Woodfork. William was tall and lanky with a patchy beard, just like Katrina had described, and he was very, very nervous seeming. He was having a really hard time sitting still. Police had not told William why he was here, and so Reuven figured William was likely very worried about getting busted for dealing drugs. But Reuven acted like he didn't notice, and he just casually reached into a folder and pulled out a photo of Eric, and he placed it on the table in front of William, and he said to William, "This man right here in this photo is a guy named Eric, and he was just murdered." And then Reuven asked William, "How long have you known Eric?" William looked down at the photo, and after staring for a second, he just shook his head and said he'd never met the guy. Reuven smiled a very knowing smile and then told William it was not a good idea to be lying to the police. I mean, this is a homicide investigation. This is about as serious as it gets. Reuven told William he had Eric's phone records, so he knew William had texted Eric the night before Eric got murdered. Immediately, William hung his head and stared at the floor and then began backtracking. He admitted to Reuven that actually he had sold Eric weed a few times, including on that past Monday night. At this point, Reuben stopped smiling, and he immediately asked William, "Okay, fine, you sold him weed on Monday. Why did you go to Eric's apartment early on Tuesday morning at around 5 a.m.? William immediately looked up and told Reuben he was not some big-time drug dealer out settling scores. He's like, "I had nothing to do with Eric getting killed." But Reuben was not about to take the word of someone who had literally just lied to his face. And with the phone records and William admitting he saw Eric the night before the murder, Reuben felt like he had more than enough evidence to pursue this lead further. So, not long after that meeting, Reuben secured a warrant to search William's apartment. And when they did search his apartment in the week following Eric's murder, police would find a .380 caliber handgun, the same type of handgun that had been used to kill Eric. And so Detective Reuben was pretty much positive he had just found Eric's killer. But later that week, when the ballistics report on Williams' gun came back, it showed the ammunition used in his gun did not match the bullet casing that was found in Eric's bedroom, meaning this gun was not the murder weapon. Reuben was not willing to totally eliminate William as a suspect. It just seemed too coincidental that this guy would happen to have a .380 caliber handgun in his apartment, but it could be just a bizarre coincidence. And without more compelling evidence, he knew any case brought against William would not hold up in court. And so suddenly, Reuben felt like this investigation had just stalled in a major way. Investigators went from believing they had their killer right back to having no idea who they were even looking for. And at the same time, Reuben began getting daily calls from Eric's sisters, but he had no new information to share with them. And Reuben told other investigators that he felt like he was letting Eric's family down. Weeks passed without any new leads coming in, and then several months went by, and pretty soon this case became much less of a priority for the department. But Reuben refused to let the case just go cold. In fact, he put a photo of Eric on his desk to remind him of the job he still needed to do. And he continued to talk to Eric's sisters almost every day, and he promised them as long as he was on the force, he would never stop looking for their brother's killer. In May of 2013, almost a year after Eric's murder, Detective Reuben continued his investigation. But almost no new evidence had surfaced, and so he was basically running out of ideas. Reuben pored over Eric's case files whenever he could, looking for anything that he might have just overlooked. And there was one piece of evidence, or really a missing piece of evidence, that had always bothered him. The gun that had been used to kill Eric had never been found. So now, Reuben decided to try something he knew was a total long shot, but he felt like he had nothing to lose. Police often confiscated guns as evidence in investigations, and they occasionally received guns that people had simply found and turned into them. So, Reuben reached out to every police department in the county and asked for a list of all the .380 caliber handguns they had received in the past year, either confiscated as evidence or turned into them by a Good Samaritan. The other departments all cooperated, and soon Reuben ended up with this list of 60 .380 caliber handguns. And then Reuben began the painstaking work of tracking down the history of each of those 60 guns. And the first 58 guns led him nowhere. But when he began looking into the 59th gun on the list, he thought he might have found something promising. That gun had been found discarded on the side of the road on the Capitol Beltway, one of the busiest streets in Washington, D.C. The man who had handed this gun over to police had been sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic and just happened to look over and see the gun lying on the side of the road. And that spot on the Beltway was not very far from Eric's apartment. But there was another detail in this report about this 59th gun that gave Reuben the biggest jolt of energy he'd felt in almost a year. The man who found this gun had found it just 2 days after Eric's murder. Using the 59th gun's serial number, Detective Reuben tracked down the weapon's original owner, but that man told Reuben he'd actually sold the gun at a pawn shop years earlier, and so Reuben found that pawn shop and got their sales records for the gun, and from there, Reuben started tracking down every one of the gun's previous owners, and there were quite a few of them. And this process dragged on for weeks and weeks, but finally, right around the actual 1-year anniversary of Eric's death, Reuben talked to a man who had sold this 59th gun to a pawn shop just a few months before Eric was killed. And so Reuben felt like there was a legitimate chance that whoever had bought the gun from this latest pawn shop was the killer. Now, the pawn shop was nowhere near Reuben's police station, but he decided he would take a trip there, hoping all of his work would pay off. So, on a hot and humid June day, Detective Reuven, along with several other officers, walked into the pawn shop on the outskirts of a small rural town. Reuven thought it was the kind of place someone would never find unless they already knew it existed. The pawn shop owner greeted Reuven from behind the counter in a very thick southern drawl, and he asked how he could help. Reuven told the owner he was looking for sales records on a particular gun, and then he gave the owner the serial number of the gun. But the owner right away just sighed and said he was really sorry, but he couldn't do that. He'd stored those sales records in diaper boxes out in a shed behind the shop, and earlier that year, rats had gotten into the shed and started gnawing away at all the diaper boxes. The owner was worried he would lose the records to the rats, and he knew losing gun sale records could get him in big trouble with the federal government, so he handed over all those records inside of the chewed-up diaper boxes to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or the ATF. The ATF is a United States government agency that primarily monitors firearms trafficking. Reuven just stood there and stared at the pawn shop owner. He felt like laughing at how absurd this was. He never imagined diaper boxes and rats would play a role in his homicide investigation, but here he was. And so ultimately, Reuven thanked the owner and then left the pawn shop and headed back to Montgomery County, Maryland, to the police station. And once he got there, he called an ATF agent that he knew and told him what had happened. Reuven offered to go to ATF storage and personally dig through all the chewed-up diaper boxes himself, but the agent assured him the ATF would find whatever he needed. And on June 12, 2013, so over a year after Eric's murder, Reuven got a call at his desk from that ATF agent. And the agent told Reuven that they had just tracked down all those diaper boxes, and they had found the specific report Reuven was looking for, and so he was faxing the report over right now. Reuven thanked the agent and hung up the phone, but as soon as he did, he felt so nervous. It was like every muscle in his body was getting tense. He knew if this report that he was about to read didn't give him any new information, he would have no idea what to do next. And so as he was thinking about this, he looked over at the photo of Eric on his desk and just held his breath. The fax machine near his desk started printing out the report. Reuven got up, walked over to the machine, grabbed the report, and began to read through it. And as he did, Reuven felt like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. After more than a year of investigating this case and weeks of tracking down gun owners all over the place, Reuven knew, based on this report, that he could call Eric's siblings right now and tell them he had found their brother's killer. Based on records from the ATF and evidence collected over the course of a year, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Samoa in the early morning hours of June 5th, 2012. The killer was standing at the foot of Eric's bed, watching him sleep. They'd been standing there for a few minutes, just staring, but they knew now it was time to act. So they reached into their bag that was slung over their shoulder and pulled out a .380 caliber handgun. The killer then walked forward until they were right next to Eric, trying to be as quiet as possible. They didn't know what Eric would do if he suddenly woke up. And so at this point, the killer kind of leaned over Eric until they were so close to him they could actually feel Eric's breath on their cheek. Then they slowly pulled up their gun and aimed it basically point blank at Eric's forehead, and then they fired. The bullet lodged inside of Eric's brain, and he died without ever waking up. The killer quickly tossed the gun into their bag and then pulled the bedsheet up to Eric's mouth to try to cover up some of the blood. Then the killer ran out of the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind them. They opened up the front door, they locked the doorknob, and then closed it, and then they ran down the hallway to the elevator. As the elevator was making its way down, the killer took several steadying breaths, doing their best to look as calm as possible. When the elevator doors opened, the killer walked across the lobby, went out to the parking lot, got in their car, and began driving towards Washington, D.C. Now, it was still dark out, and the killer saw headlights up ahead from a line of cars driving towards the city, and so since they didn't want to get caught in traffic, the killer just hit the gas and whipped down the road. The killer reached the Capitol Beltway in D.C. before traffic got too bad, and at this point, they rolled their window down, reached into their bag in the passenger seat, grabbed the murder weapon, and threw it out the window. The first chance they had, the killer turned around and sped back across the Maryland border. About 30 minutes after fleeing Eric's apartment, the killer walked back into Eric's apartment building, except this time, when they got in the elevator, they did not go up to the 6th floor. They went up to a lower floor. And then once they got to that floor, they got out of the elevator, walked down the hall, and went inside of their own apartment. And once they were inside, they showered, put on a nurse's uniform, and went right back downstairs to go to work. Katrina Benn, Eric's basketball-loving, casual romantic partner, was Eric's killer. It would turn out Katrina wanted a lot more out of her relationship with Eric. She did not like the idea of it being casual. And the week before the murder, Eric had blown off Katrina on a night they were supposed to hook up. Katrina knew Eric was out with actually another woman, and she told him she was not okay with that. But Eric was just not ready to be in a fully committed relationship with Katrina. In fact, he didn't even want his family to meet her. So Katrina started to feel like Eric was only using her for sex, and it made her really angry. So angry that she decided she would kill him. When Katrina first arrived at Eric's apartment to watch the basketball game, she had the gun with her, but she just wasn't sure if this night was going to be the night that she actually followed through. But Eric's impromptu drug deal gave Katrina potential cover. She could make up a story and say the dealer had shown up at Eric's apartment and seemed really suspicious, and basically make it seem like the drug dealer had killed Eric. However, the dealer, William Woodfork, had nothing to do with the murder. He had never even been to Eric's apartment. It took Detective Reuven tracking down the gun that was used to kill Eric and delving into the gun's history to finally discover Katrina was the killer, because he had traced the gun back to a pawn shop in a small rural town in Mississippi that just happened to be Katrina's hometown. Now, at this point, Reuven was very sure Katrina was the killer. However, he needed a receipt that showed she was the one who bought this gun last. But when he went to the pawn shop in Mississippi, those sales records were in that shed getting destroyed by rats, and so they had been shipped to the ATF. But Reuven was able to get those records from the ATF, and as soon as he looked through them, he saw right there Katrina's name was on the record. She had bought the murder weapon. She definitely was the killer. And so Katrina would be arrested at her parents' house in Mississippi, and she would be found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 20 years with no chance for parole. To this day, Eric's family say it was Reuven's patience and determination that ultimately got justice for their little brother and gave the family some sense of closure. Bright summer day in 1906, and Dr. William C. Clark and his wife Harriet were driving slowly through a beautiful part of northwestern Connecticut called Litchfield County. Litchfield is a rural, very hilly area with lots of winding country roads, and the Clarks were there to try to scout out an area to build their second home. The couple lived full-time in New York City, where Dr. Clark was an oncologist, which is a cancer doctor, and he was also a professor at the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. And while the Clarks' lives were very exciting and fulfilling in the city, they were also very hectic and chaotic. And so the reason they had settled on Litchfield as the place to look for a location for their second home is because it was the total opposite of the city. It was quiet, it was peaceful, it was perfect. And so as this couple from New York City drove along these winding backcountry roads, they eventually reached this beautiful covered wooden bridge, and after they drove across it, they got this view up onto this mountainside off to their right, and high up on this mountain was this huge, shaded, beautiful forest. And they saw there was a road that appeared to kind of spider off and go into these woods. Now, the couple had no idea what was up there, but it was just so beautiful, and they were immediately so drawn to it that they decided they would go check it out and see if maybe there was a spot for their second home in these woods. And so Dr. Clark took the car and he went up this access road, and very quickly as they began climbing up this hillside, the road became very bumpy and overgrown. It was pretty obvious that not many cars were driving into these woods, and so before they even reached the tree line, Dr. Clark had to pull the car over and park it on the side of the road, and then he and Harriet got out, and then on foot they continued up towards the forest. And once the couple actually entered the forest, immediately the sunlight faded because the canopy over their heads was so thick, and the air became cool and refreshing. And after walking for only a couple of minutes, the forest, which at first seemed very still and quiet, suddenly became alive. They could hear birds chirping and animals running around and insects buzzing. And then up ahead, they saw there was this field off to the side of the road that was full of all these wild apple trees growing in all different directions. And as they got closer, they saw there was just a deer right in the middle of the apple trees eating apples directly off the branches. And then just past all these apple trees, the couple began passing these huge, beautiful patches of roses and lilacs and bright yellow bitter tansy flowers that lined the road. And then before long, the couple was stepping over these babbling brooks, and off in the distance, they could hear the sound of running water like fresh spring water coming down off the mountain. And then, as the sun did begin to poke through the canopy above them, it almost looked like the forest was sparkling, literally. This forest was sitting on a hillside, and the hillside, which was made up of rock, had mica inside of it. And mica is a kind of mineral that when sunlight hits it, it almost looks like it's shimmering. And of course, there were the owls. As Dr. Clark and his wife walked farther and farther into this beautiful forest, they heard more and more owls hooting off in the distance. And to the Clarks, this made the forest feel enchanted. It was like the owls were personally greeting them. By the time the couple had turned around and begun heading back to their car, they had already made up their mind that they were going to build their second home in that forest. And so, after returning to their home in New York, they promptly put in the paperwork to purchase 1,000 acres inside of that Connecticut forest. And that forest had a name. It was called Dark Entry, and it was named that because it looked like from the outside, the forest was basically dark all the time. There was shade cast on it from mountains nearby, and then also the canopy inside of Dark Entry is exceptionally thick. At one time, there actually had been a town inside of Dark Entry Forest. However, all the people who had lived in that town were now all gone. The only remnants of this town were a couple of crumbling stone walls and a couple of home foundations that were scattered about the Dark Entry forest floor. The Clarks had seen some of these ruins as they walked along this overgrown path through the forest, but they weren't concerned. Instead, they felt like these ruins actually added some charm to the forest. After the land purchase was finalized, Dr. Clark began looking for local builders in Connecticut who could help him build this second home inside of Dark Entry Forest. But no matter how much money he offered these local Connecticut builders, they all said no. Now, none of them gave a straight answer to Dr. Clark about why they were turning him down. So Dr. Clark just kind of assumed that, hey, this project is not huge. It's just one house. And the forest is pretty isolated and hard to get to. And so he thought, probably these builders think it's not worth the effort. But Dr. Clark was not discouraged. He decided he would just build the house himself. After all, he was a very handy, competent guy who had grown up on a farm in New Jersey, and so he knew how to build things. And so, for the next several months, Dr. Clark would travel from New York City to Dark Entry Forest every weekend, and he would build this home. First, he cut down this massive swath of hemlock trees on this one flat patch of his land, and then with all this lumber he had cut down, he built his rustic two-story cabin on this flat part of his land. And then nearby on this hilltop, there was a freshwater spring at the top, and so he laid piping from the spring into his cabin so they could have fresh water. And then at the bottom of this nearby hill was this brook, and Dr. Clark loved just standing and watching this brook because inside of it were all these trout that would dart all around. And so Dr. Clark built a swimming pool with beautiful mossy embankments right up against this brook so he could sit there and watch the fish. By Thanksgiving of that year, the cabin was done, and so Dr. Clark and his wife Harriet, they stayed at the cabin to celebrate the holiday. And as they were sitting in their swimming pool watching the trout and listening to the owls hoot off in the distance, they both agreed that this second home was like their little piece of heaven. So every summer from there on out, and every major holiday that they could manage it, the Clarks would travel to their home in Dark Entry Forest, and they would swim and hike and relax, and they'd watch the leaves on the mountainside turn from green to bright yellows and oranges and reds. It was perfect. That is, until 1918. That summer, the couple was in their second home in the forest when Dr. Clark was suddenly called back to New York to attend to a medical emergency.
Harriet was very upset at the prospect of suddenly being left alone in this cabin in the middle of the forest by herself for who knows how many days. And so when she dropped her husband off at the nearby train platform, she made him promise that he would come back soon. And he said he would. And then Dr. Clark got on the train, it took off, and Harriet just stood there with her arms crossed, watching it as it chugged along off into the distance. From his comfortable seat on that train, Dr. Clark had no idea that his wife was about to endure a nightmare while he was gone. When the Clarks bought their 1,000 acres in the Dark Entry Forest, they did virtually no research on the forest or the surrounding area. If they had, they very likely would not have purchased that land. You see, the town that used to be inside of the Dark Entry Forest, that was now just ruins that the Clarks saw when they first walked around inside of the forest, was abandoned for a very specific reason. It was cursed. At least that's what the locals say. And in fact, that was the reason why no builders in the area were willing to go with Dr. Clark into the forest to go build his house, because they were too scared to go anywhere near the ruins of this cursed town. This town, which was known as Dudleytown, was first settled sometime in the 1740s. At first, it was just a couple of people and a couple of small structures, but pretty quickly, 30 families had moved in and it was a thriving little town. But as the 1700s came to a close, terrible things began to happen to residents of this town. First, there was the Carter family. They moved to Dudleytown in 1759, and shortly after arriving there, 6 members of their family all died suddenly from cholera. The remaining branch of the Carter family was so grief-stricken from their losses that they left Dudleytown and went to New York, where they resettled. But almost immediately after getting set up there, Native Americans raided their property and massacred them, and the 3 people that survived this massacre were 3 of the kids, and they were all kidnapped and taken away. In 1792, a Dudley resident named Hollister died suddenly. Now, we don't know if he fell off a roof or if he was murdered, no one really knows, but what we can agree on is that his untimely death happened in the home of a man named Tanner. And Tanner, following Hollister's death, suddenly just began obsessively talking about these strange creatures he was seeing out in the woods at night, kind of roaming around the Dark Entry Forest. And he talked about it all the time and nobody listened to him. And eventually Tanner went insane and his daughter had to care for him for the rest of his life. And while Tanner was slowly losing his mind, his next door neighbor named Abel also began reporting that he was seeing weird creatures roaming around the tree line all around the town. And as Abel continued to report seeing these strange creatures lurking in the shadows, he too slowly went mad and had to be cared for until his death. In the early 1800s, a famous Revolutionary War hero, General Herman Swift, who lived in Dudleytown, lost his mind shortly after his wife was struck by lightning. And then in 1813, an unknown epidemic rolled through Dudleytown and killed many of its residents. After that, more and more residents of Dudleytown either died suddenly or died mysteriously, and also more and more residents began coming forward with stories about having seen these strange, shadowy creatures moving around the tree line at night. By about 1900, all the Dudleytown residents had either died or simply just left, abandoning their homes, except for one family, the Brophies. But in quick succession, the Brophy family's sheep all died, then the mother died of tuberculosis, then the 2 sons were accused of theft in a nearby town, and then they just disappeared, leaving one person, John Brophy, the father. But the Brophy family home burned to the ground, and so John, who was overcome with grief, just wandered off into the forest and was never heard from again. At that point, Dudleytown officially became a ghost town. No one lived there. And it was at that point, in 1906, when Dr. Clark and Harriet had their beautiful summer's day walk through the forest and discovered where they wanted to build their second home. So, fast forward back to 1918, and Dr. Clark, he's on his medical emergency leave to New York. It winds up being very quick. He's back on a train within 36 hours, and he pulls into the station right near Dark Entry Forest, and he's expecting to see Harriet waiting on the platform for him. But when the train rolled into the station, she wasn't there. Now, Dr. Clark was not a superstitious person, but for some reason, when he didn't see his wife there, he just felt like something was off. There's no reason she wouldn't have come out here to greet him. I mean, she was worried about being all alone in the cabin, and she knew he was going to be arriving at that moment. And so, feeling a little bit panicked, Dr. Clark left the train station and on foot made his way over to the Dark Entry Forest. And when he got there and began walking on that overgrown road path that led to his house, immediately, as soon as he was within the shade of the trees, he began hearing these owls hooting very loudly off in the distance. Now, normally, the sound of these owls hooting made him feel welcome, but this time he felt scared. He felt like something was wrong up ahead. And so he began jogging through the forest, and it's very dark, and all he can hear is the sound of these owls, and it's getting louder and louder and louder. And then finally, he reaches the clearing where his property is. And at this point, it's a cacophony of owls hooting practically right on top of him, and he looks up towards his house up on this hill, and he sees the front door is slightly open. And so now, with his heart racing, wondering what's going on with his wife, Dr. Clark runs up to his front porch, he gets to the door, and he flings it open the rest of the way, and then right before he stepped into his house, this sudden high-pitched noise began up on the second floor inside of his house. And it was so startling to Dr. Clark that he just froze where he was. And so suddenly it's so loud from the owls all around him and the woods behind him and whatever this noise is that he just stood there unsure what to do. And so as he's sitting there getting the courage up to go investigate his house, he realizes what this high-pitched noise is. It's the sound of maniacal, insane laughter coming from the second floor. Sensing his wife had to be in danger, the doctor charged up the nearby steps up to the second floor, and he could tell this laughter, this high-pitched laughter, was coming from the master bedroom. And so he ran down the short hallway, he got in front of the closed door that led into the master bedroom, he slowly opened it up, and there, in the back corner of his room, was his wife. She was on the ground, rolled up in a ball, facing the door. Her hands were clenched in fists, her eyes were open and unblinking, and her mouth was open wider than was humanly possible. And as he's staring at his wife, wondering what's going on, he realizes this insane, high-pitched laughter is coming from his wife. But it doesn't even look like it's coming out of her. Her chest is just heaving, her mouth is staying open, and the laughter is just coming out of her. And so the doctor just stood there watching his wife, who's staring directly at his eyes. And finally, he just got so scared, he turned and he ran. During Dr. Clark's 36 hours he was away in New York, something happened to his wife. We don't know what it was, but it caused her to lose her mind. The only thing she would talk about was the strange creatures she saw out in the forest. By some accounts, Harriet spent the rest of her life in a mental asylum. By other accounts, she went back with Dr. Clark to New York, where she took her life. Today, Dudleytown is not only still abandoned, but it is also illegal to visit. However, people do still sneak into Dudleytown and walk around the ruins, and many of them have reported feeling these pockets of cold air where there shouldn't be cold air, and also some others have said as they've been walking, they've felt phantom hands slap them and push them. Some have said they've taken photographs inside of the Dark Entry Forest near Dudleytown, and they've captured strange, shadowy figures that they couldn't see with their naked eye. The famous paranormal couple, Ed and Lorraine Warren, shot a special series in the 1970s inside of the Dark Entry Forest, and they declared the area around Dudleytown was demonically possessed. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button is playing an intense game of online FIFA, wait until they take the lead and then unplug the Wi-Fi. Also, please subscribe to our channel.